The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Randy Opfer with the California Air Resources Board. Hopefully you're all here this afternoon for course MS 521.9. We're going to be talking about some compliance options and reporting requirements. We'll get started here in just a second, but I have to go through a couple of administrative things before we can do that. First, I need to know if people can hear me. So can somebody in the questions dialog box say they can hear the audio? There we go. Okay. Thank you, Sean. Fantastic. And Brittany, very good. Fantastic. So that means that the audio is coming across fine, so we can get going with the rest of the presentation. And one of the reasons that I wanted people to answer me in the questions dialog box is because I want to get you tuned into that particular area of your screen. During the presentation, Katie, who's online right now, Katie, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone.
Katie is going to actually be a presenter for half this presentation today, but while I'm presenting, she's going to be managing the questions dialog box. So if you have questions that occur to you about the information we're going over, put them in there. She's going to try and answer them to the best of her ability. And then if there's a question that either causes issues or it's important enough for her to read to the rest of the class, she'll stop me and we'll address it during the session. When I take over for her, I will do the same thing. So that's administrative thing number one. Administrative thing number two is the handout. So on the right-hand side, just below the questions dialog box, you should have something that says handouts 1 of 5. If you look in that area, you'll see that there is a PDF file. This is a copy, a hard copy, if you will, of all the slides that we're going to show you this afternoon. So this is yours to download at any point. You can download it right now. You can download it anytime during the presentation. If you don't get to it sometime during the presentation and you forget, because it's not available after we close this thing out, don't worry. Just send either Katie or I an email and we will make sure that you get a copy of this. Administrative thing number 3 is that this presentation, as well as all of our presentations, is being recorded. So we use GoToWebinar, and when we give a presentation, it's recorded and uploaded to their site. About 2 hours after we're done with the presentation, anybody can go and review that material. They can look at the video again. It does require you to have a link, and that is something that, again, Katie and I can send to you if you're interested. So after we're all done, if you feel like you want to go through the material again, just let one of us know, and we'll be happy to send you that link. That's all the administrative stuff. Let's talk about the class itself. This class is one of the, I don't want to say one of the shorter ones, but it is a relatively short class compared to some of the other ones that we have. This is the information that we're going to be covering this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about the truck and bus regulation primarily, And this is a big time of year for truck and bus. If you're not aware, this is the reporting period for the truck and bus regulations. So we will cover all the ins and outs of the rule itself, as well as some of the open flexibility options, maybe a couple of the closed ones that still have issues or things you need to worry about. And then I will get into the reporting side of things. I will also be covering, it's not listed here, but I will also be covering some information on a newer regulation that was just passed in 2020. Once I get done with that, Katie's going to take over, and she's going to be dealing with the enforcement overview, the SB1 tool enforcement, and greenhouse gas. So that's where we are. All this should take somewhere around 2 to 2.5 hours. If we get done before that, fantastic. If it takes the full 2.5 hours, we're good with that as well. But I expect us to be done somewhere around 3 o'clock or so. Anyway, let's get to the material and let's talk truck and bus. Truck and bus is what I like to call an omnibus regulation. For those of you who aren't aware of the regulatory programs that ARB has put in place, either before, during, or after the truck and bus rule, we have a lot of regulations. And for on-road diesel trucks, there are more than 20 of them. Many of them were put in place prior to the truck and bus rule. And the truck and bus rule or regulation only really came about because each of the prior regulations covered a niche of use for diesel engines, on-road diesel engines. And then there was a large number of vehicles that were not covered by any of these other regulations. So we had to kind of reel them all in, and they were all put into this rule. So the omnibus part of the truck and bus rule means that it's capturing everything that was not captured before. It applies to all private and federal fleets, and a fleet in this rule is defined as having a single truck. So even if some people think that they have single trucks, they're not part of a regulation. There are some rules that we will talk about today, and one in particular that a single truck would put you out of it. But in this case, even one truck is considered a fleet. So all private and federal fleets, one or more vehicles, if they're in California running any form of diesel fuel and have a gross vehicle weight rating of more than 14,000 pounds, they are most likely in this rule. School buses are also part of this rule, and that's an interesting thing because originally school buses were not something that we were going to regulate. We thought it was politically incorrect to bring schools into the regulatory schemes. And then later on, someone decided that the school children were some of our most sensitive receptors. So we needed to regulate school buses because there was a lot of old school buses out there. And believe me, we deal a lot with school buses, and I know there's still a lot of old school buses out there. But they're part of this regulation. They just have a separate path than the one I'm mainly going to talk about. If you have school buses, I would suggest that you come to one of our other training classes. MS 523 would probably be the choice because it talks specifically about schools. Anyway, going further, two-engine street sweepers that are non-government owned fall under this regulation, and private utilities. So there is another regulation that came out prior to the truck and bus. It's the Public Agency and Utility Fleet Rule, or PAU, and it encapsulated all utilities in the state of California, whether they were private or public. Now, that is true for all utilities except private utilities at this point. As of January 1st, 2021, all the private utilities now fall under the truck and bus rule. If you are a part of a utility organization, then you need to figure out whether or not you're private or public. And the defining line for me most of the times is it a public, can you buy stock in it? If I can buy stock in PG&E, for example, PG&E is a public company. So that would fall under this regulation, not if I'm sorry, that's wrong. I said public versus private. If you can buy stock in it, it's a private utility. Public utilities are owned by government agencies, so they still fall under the PAU regulation. All right, here's the screen that gives you more information about that because it is something that just recently happened. If you're still unsure after having this information, we've given you a telephone number that you can dial up and talk to somebody there, and they'll go through a set of questions to determine, where you fit. But again, the basic defining factor for me has always been: can you buy stock in it or not? If you can buy stock in a company, then it's probably in the private utility sector, and it's going to fall under truck and bus. Who do we hold responsible for the compliance of these vehicles we're talking about? So obviously, if you own one of these, you're going to be held responsible. If you lease or rent a vehicle, it's possible that you may be held responsible for that vehicle. It all depends on the contract language that you signed when you leased or rented that piece of equipment. So if there's a stipulation in the contract that says that you are responsible for it, then you are responsible for it. Otherwise, it defaults to the company that's doing the leasing or renting. Now, in California, we do not limit the sale of vehicles that fall under this rule. You can sell any vehicle you want to, anytime you want to anybody you want to, as long as there is a notification. I'm going to show you a notification in just a couple of minutes that shows you what you have to do. California-based brokers and dispatchers, and I can't remember, let me just check something. Yeah, okay. California-based brokers and dispatchers actually is an interesting point to bring up, because this is something that was not part of some of our earlier regulations, but it is part of most of the regulations that have come out in the last 10 years. We're kind of throwing out an enforcement arm that allows us to capture more compliance without actually having to hire more people to do inspections. Because one of the things in the rule basically says that if you are hiring somebody to do work for you, and they're going to use a piece of equipment like a truck to do that work, then you have a responsibility to only hire somebody with a compliant fleet. So if you just hire somebody and they're not compliant, and we wound up giving them a ticket for one reason or another, and we find out that you hired them and didn't do your due diligence to determine their compliance, well, then we could cite you at the same time. I'm going to show you some ways to actually meet that particular requirement fairly simply, so don't worry about that. But you're supposed to verify and hire only compliant fleets. Let's talk about sales disclosure. I told you a minute ago that we don't limit the sale of vehicles that fall under this regulation at all. But what we do require is that if you're going to sell a vehicle that falls under this regulation to somebody else who's going to use it in the state of California, or if you don't know where they're going to use it, you might want to include this language in any case. But if you know they're going to use it in the state of California, then the language that is highlighted on the bottom of this slide, that is paraphrased or phrased there, is required to be somewhere on the sales documentation. Whatever paperwork you use, whether it's just a bill of sale, a sales contract, or maybe the back of a business card, although I'm not sure how you're going to fit that all on the back of a business card, but anyway, whatever that documentation is, that language has to be on it. And all it is a warning to the new owner that says this vehicle falls under a regulation. We require you to retain a copy of that for 3 years. And this is not something that will ever be asked for outside of an audit. So we don't ask for this information out in the field. We don't care about that when we're inspecting vehicles out in the field, but we do care about it when we look at whole fleets and we audit whole fleets. Okay, there are some exclusions. Every rule that we write typically will have some exclusions. This one is no different. So all emergency vehicles and emergency use of non-emergency vehicles is exempt from this regulation. Military tactical vehicles also are exempt. Personal use motorhomes, that's an interesting one, because these are just like regular trucks. Same size engines, same size whatever, and same kind of emissions. But because it's a personal use motorhome, it was given a basic exemption from this regulation. That also includes fifth wheels hauled by a semi-tractor trailer like the one pictured here, as long as you can demonstrate that that's the only thing that it does. If you use it to haul that fifth wheel, sometimes, when you're on vacation, and then you use it as a regular commercial vehicle the rest of the time, then it does not get this exemption. But I needed to mention it because we have had some questions related to that. Personally used pickup trucks that are less than or equal to 19,500 pounds are exempt from this regulation. There's some interesting stuff that goes on with this. We've got a slide just a second that's going to go over this specifically, so I'll hold off on talking about that for just a minute. Historic vehicles, those are your show vehicle types like the one you see here. These are ones that people are not really allowed because of the way they're required to be registered through DMV. They're not allowed to haul things with this kind of vehicle anymore. It's allowed to drive around without being compliant, but it does have to be registered as historic, and it has limitations on what else you can do with it. And vehicles subject to any other in-use regulation. Now, I told you that there were several rules that were written prior to the truck and bus rule, and that's why I called this one an omnibus regulation, because it covered everything that wasn't regulated before. So if a vehicle falls under one of those other regulations, then it doesn't fall under truck and bus. It doesn't mean that it's not regulated, even though I say it has an exclusion here. It has an exclusion from the truck and bus rule, but it is covered by another rule. A good example would be a drayage truck. Drayage is a term used to describe vehicles or trucks that haul containers from ports and or rail yards. Once a vehicle hauls a container anywhere in the state of California, it is considered a drayage truck, and it falls under a rule that was specifically written for drayage vehicles. It does not fall under this truck and bus rule, at least not until 2023 when the two rules come together. All right, so I was talking about the pickup trucks. Pickup trucks create a little bit of an issue for us when we're looking at trying to make sure they're in compliance. I did not know this prior to learning about truck and bus and dealing with the regulation and everything related to it, but I have come since to learn that all pickup trucks, all personal use pickup trucks, are considered commercial vehicles, and when you look at their DMV registration, it shows them as commercial vehicles, all the way down to the smallest pickup truck to the biggest pickup truck. Now, I keep using that term pickup truck. How do you define a pickup truck? Because in this rule, in the language, it specifically says if that pickup truck is 19,500 pounds or less, it's exempt. But when we do a search in DMV's database, which is how we find some of the non-compliant vehicles that we try to eliminate as far as, or try and bring into compliance, not eliminate. But when we look for them in the database, all these pickup trucks show up as commercial vehicles. So if it's over 14,000 and it's diesel and it's a pickup truck, it's going to show up in the searches that we do in DMV's database, even though there's an exemption for the ones that are 14,001 up to and including 19.5. It's because they're all commercial vehicles. In the language as to what a pickup truck actually is one key element, and that is that in order to be considered a pickup truck and be exempt, it has to have a standard pickup bed. That's what makes a pickup truck. If you believe that you have a pickup truck that's personal use only and it's getting caught up into this whole registration thing related to the truck and bus rule, or you're in some enforcement issue related to the truck and bus rule, we're going to ask you to do a couple of things. We're going to ask you to use what's on the screen here. This is a database that was created specifically for putting vehicles like pickup trucks in so that they do not get caught up in our enforcement actions. So, but it needs to have a standard pickup bed. I was dealing with the person, this is several months ago, but I was up in the Redding area before all this COVID stuff started happening. And I was talking to a gentleman at an event there who had retired from Southern California and bought himself his dream truck. He had picked himself up a 2006 Ford F450. Beautiful truck. Okay. Unfortunately, he did two things. Well, one, I say unfortunately, he wanted it this way, so it wasn't unfortunate for him, but it was unfortunate in a regulatory manner. And that is, first he bought diesel, so it's going to fall under diesel regulations because it's a pickup truck over 14,000 pounds. Second, he could have still landed in the exempt vehicle if he had left the standard pickup bed on this. But he decided that based on what he wanted to do with this thing up at the ranch he had up in that area, was it would require him to have a flatbed and a Tommy lift on the back of this thing. Now those two are very useful if that's the kind of work that you do and they work for you. Unfortunately, when somebody in our agency sees a flatbed with stake side and a Tommy lift, we can't consider that a pickup truck anymore. That is a commercial truck. Doesn't matter how you use it, it's a commercial truck. So I hope I'm explaining this well enough for you to understand. that there is an exemption here for pickup trucks that are of the right size or less. But they still can get caught up into the whole regulation because of the way they're defined in DMV's database. And we've tried to create a way for that to be eliminated, and it's right here on the screen. So if you know anybody in that situation, please let them know, or if you're in that situation yourself, please take advantage of this database. All right, enough said about that. Let's get into the regulation proper. Before I can actually get into the requirements, though, we do need to break down the requirements, how the requirements are divided in this regulation. So in this rule, we, when the language is put together, we categorized all the trucks in the rule as one of two types. They're either light trucks or heavy trucks. And the light trucks are any truck that's over 14,000 pounds, so 14,001, up to and including 26,000 pounds gross weight. The heavy trucks would be anything over 26,000 pounds. If you want to look at this in terms of industry standards, light trucks are your class 4, 5, and 6. Your heavy trucks are class 7 and 8. Before I or anybody else can tell you what your requirements are, you need to know what the gross weight of your truck is. Well, how do you get there? Well, I'm going to show you. On this slide, you can see two things, two incredibly important pieces of information and where to find them related to this rule. The first is the gross weight. Most vehicles are going to have a tag somewhere on the inside driver's door jamb or somewhere on the door jamb itself, like the one you see pictured here, that will give you the gross weight of the vehicle. This has not really much to do with the engine. It has to do with how the vehicle was constructed and how much weight it can actually hold and pull and haul. That weight, once it's assigned by the manufacturer of the truck, does not change. That's why we use it. That weight is the one that our inspectors are going to look at when they try and determine what your requirements are. So this is the number that we need you to find, or when we look at trucks, we try to find it. So there are going to be a number of different weights listed on this tag, and you can see some here. There's rear axle weight, there's unladen weight, all kinds of different things here. The only one that matters for us is the one that says gross weight, or could say gross vehicle weight rating, or it could say GVWR. Any one of those will work, but it's all the same number. One additional thing I'd like to say about that, because I have had some people who built what are called glider kit trucks. This is where you take the chassis of whatever truck you want and put a new top on it. You build a truck basically to conform to whatever you are specifically wanting to use it for. You can, in a glider kit, you can have any combination of different things going on there. And when you do something like that, whoever is building the truck is actually required by federal law to put a new tag with the new gross weight on it after the vehicle's constructed. That tag may not necessarily be on the inside driver's door jamb. I've seen them on the header by the door. I've seen them on other parts of the door jamb, but it has to be somewhere on the vehicle. The second piece of information shown here is something called an emissions control label, or ECL. If you haven't already heard about what this is, you're a little bit behind, but let me tell you, this is something that we've been kind of harping on and dealing with for years now. This is a tag that is required by federal law to be on the engine of all on-road diesel engines over 6,000 pounds built since 1974. It is a tag that gives the reader the model year of the engine, as well as some other information. It talks about emissions-related information, including the model year of the engine itself, because all the requirements, and that's the important part, all the requirements associated with this rule, I said, are based on weight rating. We've already talked about that. And the model year of the engine, not the model year of the truck. Those can be different and oftentimes are. So it's the model year of the engine. The only place you can really find the model year of the engine is going to be on that tag. Now that tag is supposed to be legally somewhere on the engine itself. It is unfortunately oftentimes missing, washed off, painted over, destroyed in some manner to where it cannot be read. If one of our inspectors is looking at your truck to do enforcement, they are going to try and find that tag. If they can't read it or can't find it, they're going to write you a ticket or a citation for not having the tag, because you've essentially broken federal law, and since we enforce it, it's state law as well, and you stop them from doing their inspection. This is the single most common citation written by our officers every single year. They write thousands of those tickets. So what happens if you don't have that sticker on your engine anymore? Well, you have to go to the dealership or a manufacturer's representative, which is typically a dealership. They have the ability to get a new one and install it for you. Anyway, that's the deal. We need that information. You need that information if you want to know what your requirements are. So let's go through those requirements. And we're going to start with a light truck. So I told you there were two types of trucks, either light or heavy. This is the basic requirement, or what we call the model year compliance schedule for light trucks. And it's pretty simple. It only has two columns, one for the engine year and one for the requirement. The engine year is what it is. We found that on the tag just a minute ago. I showed you that tag. The requirement is pretty simple as well. It says 2000 model year engine. That means that on whatever date is listed under that column, the vehicle's engine has to meet 2010 emission standards. I'll say that again. Whatever date that is for the engine we're looking at, it has to meet 2010 model year emission standards. So let's do an example. Let's say I have a 2000 model year truck. It's not going to have a 2000 model year engine, most likely. It'll probably have a 1999 engine. So if I look in the left-hand column for 1999, I go across to the date listed there. It says January 1st, 2019. That means that my requirement for my light truck was, because that date has already passed, it was that on January 1st of 2019, my 1999 engine had to meet 2010 emission standards. Well, how do you do that? Because there is no retrofit that you could pop on an older engine to make it 2010 model year compliant. The only way you could meet that standard is by having a 2010 or newer engine. That means getting rid of the old engine and putting a new engine in its place, a repower. That is a very expensive thing to do. Most people will not do that because it can cost more than the actual truck is worth. So if you don't want to spend the money to update to a 2010 engine, then what do? Well, the choices aren't great. It's retire, replace, or repower. I already mentioned that one. Retire, replace, repower, or drop down to low use. We're going to talk about low use a little bit later, but those are your choices. Last thing I'll say about this chart for the light trucks is that if you are in compliance with these dates and the model year, the 2010 model year engine, there is technically no reporting required. This rule does not absolutely require you to be in the reporting system. It's only when you're outside the bounds of these charts that people need to put their stuff in our system. If you're in compliance, you do not need to report. Let's look at the chart for the heavy vehicles. It's the same chart with one addition, and that is a central column called PM filter. What we did here is we had an interim requirement. So you have the model year on the far left, just like we did for the last chart. You have when it has to be 2010 model year compliant on the right, just like it was for the last chart. But in between those two periods of time, or in between those two columns, there is a date by which the owners of these trucks were required to have installed something called a diesel particulate filter. If you don't know what that is, we're going to have a class, I don't know if it's next week, but there's a class coming up, 511.2, that will go over what that technology is. But in any case, it removes the particulates, the black soot. And as you can see by the dates listed here, there is no date in the future. All trucks that are following these model year compliant schedules are already required to have filters on them or meet 2010 model year compliance. That's the other thing people forget is they get their filter on their truck and they think they're good, but they don't really remember or see that there's another date involved. So my 99 truck that my 99 engine truck that I went over just a minute ago, I was required to have a filter on it by January 1st, 2012. And then by January 1st, 2020, a full year ago, that same truck was required to meet 2010 emission standards. If it's still on the road today, it's out of compliance, most likely. Now, there were some ways, we'll talk about those, that would not be true. But in any case, this is the basic schedule. This is what our officers in the field enforce on these trucks. And again, if you're in compliance with this chart, just like I said for the lighter vehicles, if your vehicle's in compliance with what this chart says, there is no reporting required. There have been, and still are, some flexibilities in this rule that are designed to help people meet the terms of the regulation, but take a path that makes it either simpler or easier for them to get to the same result. These options are generally extensions or delays in compliance based on some attributes of either the vehicle or the fleet itself. And I'll go over some of them. But when we talk about reporting, if you're using any flexibility that was allowed in this rule, you absolutely have to have your fleet and your vehicle in the reporting system for it to work. Because here's what happens. Our inspectors out in the field are going to look for the weight of the vehicle, they're going to look for the engine model year, and then they're going to look at those two charts that I just showed you. If they can determine compliance based on that information and that path, then you're fine. But if they find that you're not in compliance with what those charts say, then they go into the reporting system to see if you have filed and are in some flexibility that allows you to not be in compliance with those charts. The only way they can determine whether you are in compliance is if your vehicle's in the reporting system. So that's why if you're using flexibility options, you have to be in the reporting system. Now, we did have a little bit of a glitch a while back. So this rule has been modified 3 times. It was modified in 2010, again in 2013, and the last time in 2014. And each time it was modified, we added more flexibilities and more time for people to comply. The issue we have here is that the last time we modified the rule back in 2014, as soon as we were done modifying the rule, we got sued by a company called Lawson Trucking based out of the Central Valley, along with the California Trucking Association. And they sued us on the basis that they and their owners and operators had already complied with the earlier version of the rule, bought new equipment, installed filters, and then when we extended the time period for people to do those things, we gave them a competitive advantage over Lawson and CTA members. And I actually do agree with that line of thought. However, I also agreed with extending things, so I'm kind of in the middle there. But back to the point of this, bringing this up here, we actually lost the case. So we filed an appeal, went back to the administrative judge, and that took 4 years. And then in April of 2018, the judge came back and renewed the decision, basically saying we lost the case again. All that means is that all the amendments that we put in place in 2014 were illegal. They were going to disappear. We could not do them, and that's good and bad. It was bad because we don't like to have to do all that work and have it thrown out. But it was good that it took all the way till 2018 because practically all of the extensions that were put there in 2014 expired in 2018 in any case. So anybody that took advantage of them got them and was able to use them because we were able to delay it out till 2018. It did have an outsized impact for some vehicles. The ones listed here did have a little bit more issues, so I need to talk a little bit more specifically about these flexibility options. The first is a flexibility for heavy cranes. Before this flexibility, I'm not sure I really knew what a heavy crane was. I mean, I've seen crane vehicles periodically, but not what's defined as a heavy crane. A heavy crane is a single engine vehicle that is just a giant piece of equipment with this huge crane that's the whole vehicle. It's nothing but a crane. It's on road, but the crane itself has to be operated by a certified crane operator. And because the crane is the only thing that this vehicle can carry, there cannot be any way for the truck to carry any other kind of cargo. So it's fairly specific. And the problem here is that this particular flexibility did not exist prior to 2014. The heavy cranes were in the same rule with everybody else. They were just heavy trucks. When we created this option, we took the heavy crane operators and owners in the state of California and put them into it, and they were following a different path. And because this particular provision was not in the rule prior to 2014, when the lawsuit happened and we lost, it was basically cut out, disappeared, and there were going to be thousands of people, thousands of trucks that were going to have some trouble complying with the rule at that point, because they were basically going to get thrown back into the regulation. What we did instead is we took the flexibility in total and we cut it out of the truck and bus rule and we inserted it into the solid waste collection vehicle rule, which was being amended anyway. So the flexibility still does exist. The crane owners and operators are still following the parameters of this flexibility. It's just that they're under a different rule than the truck and bus. So hopefully that makes sense. But I guess the one point I want to make is if you think you have a heavy crane and you're operating in California, it really needs to be in this flexibility. There isn't really a way to keep it in the truck and bus rule. It should be in this flexibility. Ag vehicles, perhaps the best flexibility allowed under this regulation. It allowed for more time and more miles for people to run trucks without having to do anything to them. The one reason it was an issue under the truck and bus rule and the amendments and then the lawsuit is because anybody that was in the ag exception or provision lost some mileage back in 2019. You were going to get 15,000 miles, but because of the lawsuit, it became 10,000 miles. So, and that's what it is today. It's 10,000 miles, and it will be 10,000 miles for this year and next year. At the end of next year, this provision goes away, January 1st of 2023, which is the end of next year. Actually, that's the end of this provision. There really wasn't anything else that happened related to the lawsuit, but I want to make sure you're aware that your current requirement is to, no more than 10,000 miles per year, and you have to report that mileage annually. I did have an interesting issue with this come up recently. As a kind of a story to let you know how things run down and what happens, I get calls on a regular basis from people that are having to report and having issues, and I got a hold of a gentleman who had a ag vehicle. It was reported. He's had it in there for 8 years, and he's been staying under the mileages and reporting every year and doing everything that we've asked him to do. Unfortunately, sometime in the last 2 years, the odometer on his truck broke, and it was not noted. He didn't know it. They kept using the truck, and when they finally figured out that there was no odometer working, they didn't have a way of monitoring the mileage that the truck had done. And there is no way to go back. He did have an hour meter on the engine, but you can't translate the hours from that use to miles. And there is no provision in this rule for hours. It's under the ag provision. So he's going to have a problem with that truck. But anyway, it's something to keep an eye on. If you're under a low use option, you have to have a functioning odometer. If the odometer doesn't function, then you're supposed to install a hub meter on one of the wheels just to know what the mileage is and how you can report it. Low NOx area is a very special circumstance. When we were putting the rule together, one of the overriding considerations was to meet federal standards for ambient air quality. Ambient air quality standards are something that we have federal ones and we have state ones, and the state ones are always a little bit more stringent. However, because we're working with the feds, the only ones we technically really have to meet under most of these rules are going to be federal ones. And when we put the rule together, we found that one of the substances that there is an ambient air quality standard for, oxides of nitrogen, we actually had several counties in the state that were meeting or well below the federal requirement. So in those counties, we did not need an improvement in NOx emissions from the trucks in this rule. Well, what that really means is that we don't need to require them to operate 2010 or newer model year engines. They can stop at the filtration and they're done with this rule. So we call those NOx exempt areas, and all the dark green counties on that map are in the NOx exempt zones. If you own and operate a truck in any one of those green counties and you always stay in the green county areas, then you do have to register for it properly. You do have to have a PM filter, but you do not ever have to convert that vehicle to a 2010 engine. It just has to be reported properly, and you have to have a filter. The reason there's two colors on this map, and the reason it's part of the lawsuit, part of this presentation, is that in 2014 we added the lighter shaded areas. So there were some people that weren't in the provision before, that came into the provision, and then when the lawsuit happened, unfortunately, they had to go back to the regular part of the rule. And that was a big deal for many people, but in any case, it is what it is, and this provision is still active and still available if you happen to qualify for it. There are also some changes related to the use of PM filters, the extended use of PM filters or retrofits, because originally the regulation had a provision that said if your entire fleet, if every truck you had was filtered prior to 2014, then it didn't matter what the model year of the engine was, and it didn't matter the model year compliance schedule. We were going to grant you use of that truck until January 1st of 2023. So for some trucks, that could be an additional 2 to 3 years of use. When we rewrote the rule in 2014, we took away the fact that it had to be your entire fleet and just said any truck filtered prior to 2014 would get that extension. Well, the extension's gone. It went away as soon as we lost the case. And there were a number of trucks and a number of people that had put filters on that were going to get an extension but did not wind up getting it, and there's no way to put it back in. So that is what it is, and that's where we are. Let's talk low use, because low use was also negatively affected by the lawsuit. It was pretty much the same thing as what happened under the ag provision. In 2019, anybody that was under low use lost 4,000 miles of use because it went from 5,000 to 1,000 miles. But the lawsuit did not eliminate the low use exemption. The low use exemption still exists, and it still reads exactly the same way. If you can keep any vehicle in your fleet under 1,000 miles per year in California, and if it operates in a stationary manner, it has to be also less than 100 hours of stationary use. But if you can do those two things, or whichever apply, then and report it properly, then that vehicle is exempt from the regulation, which means that it never has to have a filter installed and you never have to update 2010 engines. This provision has allowed a lot of people to keep older trucks going for a long period of time, beyond where they would normally have been. So it's very useful. A lot of people use it. We still get people who put their vehicles in this every year. A couple of additional things you need to know about this is, number one, earlier I was talking about exemptions and told you that emergency vehicles and emergency use of non-emergency vehicles were exempt from this rule. That's the emergency use of non-exempt vehicles comes into play here, because any vehicle that is used for emergency purposes, the mileage that you have acquire and accrue for those emergency purposes is exempt from this limitation. I'll give you an example of how that can work. I have, actually, most of you remember the Paradise Fire. You know, hopefully everybody remembers that debacle, that horrible thing that happened up in Paradise. But when that happened, I mean, that's been over 2 years ago now. When that happened, it was all hands on deck. Get any truck that needs to be used up there to put the fire out, first of all. But second of all, because the emergency declaration added the cleanup as part of the emergency, any vehicle that can be used to help clean the situation up after the fire was out also is considered an emergency use. It has to be under the employ of a government agency, using a government contract, and they have to be in an emergency zone. So how this played out for Paradise, and the reason I use that as an example is because I regularly go up in that area to use Lake Oroville, and Lake Oroville is just south of where that is. And I can tell you, for the last couple of years, every time I've gone up to that area, there are have been tons and tons and tons of really old dump trucks hauling detritus and toxic material out of the Paradise area, and they're all non-compliant, but they're being used for emergency purposes, and so the mileage is exempt from this limitation. Hopefully everybody understands that and gets the idea of what I'm talking about, and if you can, use it. If you have more questions related to this rule, we do have websites that you can go to. The Truck Stop is a website that was created specifically to warehouse information on any of our on-road regulations primarily, especially the truck and bus rule. And it's different than any of our other web pages. It functions more outside the normal page that ARB has. Much easier to follow, much easier to read, and easier to find information. So I would encourage you to visit the Truck Stop if you have any questions or need more information. Let's talk about reporting. Okay, so I said very early in this presentation that it's reporting time, because the reporting period for the truck and bus regulation is every January. January 1 to January 31st annually. If you need to report your vehicle, then it needs to be reported now. What happens if you report after January 31st? Well, that's kind of tricky, because this reporting system has been open for going on 11 years. And every year that I've been a part of it, which is all 11 years, it has stayed open past January 31st. The first year it was, I think it was April before they closed it. And it's been into March and, February. It's stayed open, because what happens is when people are having trouble reporting and our trucker staff have to aid them, as long as we're working with somebody that's having a reporting issue, we have to leave the system open so that we can make the changes and help them get through the reporting period. As long as you start the reporting process in January, it doesn't matter whether you finish it in February, March, April, or May, you're still considered to have reported on time. But if you report if you start the process after the 31st, chances are, if you do it early enough, you won't have any issue. You'll still be able to report. But there's always the specter that you could be considered as having reported late. And if that's the case, if you wind up getting some issue related to that, it's because you reported after the 31st. So if you can, try and get in there and report if that's what you need to do. This is an online system. Although there are paper forms, and some people still use the paper forms, it's a warehouse for all kinds of information related to the truck and the fleet, and a way to determine compliance. If you have questions with your fleet or questions related specifically to the reporting system, there is an email to truckers@arb.ca.gov. It's written right there on the slide. That is where we're going to tell you to go no matter what if you have reporting questions. Now, this is how you get in. This is the start page, the login page, and it's real simple. You can create an account here. You can log into your existing account. You can try to recover your username and password if you have lost them, which is the most common thing to happen. People lose these. There are also additional resources shown here that if you have questions, that they should be able to help you. In fact, the reporting guide that's shown here under resources is fantastic. It makes it really understandable, more so than I would ever have thought, how to get your vehicle into this reporting system. Now, when you log in, you should see something like this. It'll take you to the account home. It'll have the name of your fleet. It'll allow you to view or update it, to delete the fleet, check its status, and there's a place for account settings. When you go to account settings, this is where you can change your password or update your information. Two things of note here. Number one, when you create an account, we create the first password. You create the username, we create the first password, but we want you to come in and we want you to change it to something that makes more sense to you. Just make sure you write whatever that password is down and you keep it safe, because that's, again, the most common reason people are having trouble reporting. The second thing is about emails. So if whatever email is in the system in your account is the one that we're going to communicate with. If there is no email, then you're not going to get regular updates from us. if you're trying to recover any information or an account, it gets a lot more difficult when the email doesn't go to somewhere you have access to. And you may think, well, how would that happen? Because we have people who hire other people to do their reporting. And a lot of times we've had the other people use their email addresses, and when the actual account owner tries to access it, they don't have the access because it's not their email. Anyway, I would encourage you to get in here and change that to the right email, whatever that happens to be. Let's look at vehicle info and compliance status, but I'm going to tell you one thing about compliance. That'll show up, compliance status will show up on every one of these screens with these tabs on it. And that is where you're going to go to determine, or to see whether or not your fleet's compliant and to print something called a certificate. Under vehicle info, this is where you're going to have your entire fleet as you have reported it listed out. Each row represents a different vehicle. And this is where you can edit the information from the vehicle. This is where you can tell whether or not the vehicle is reported properly. So a couple of things that I like to point out. This is a little bit old. I need to update this, but it still makes a point. One of the columns that when people tell me that they're having trouble because the system says they're not compliant, I like to point them to certain places. There are two columns on the far right. One says PM filter or exemption/extension, and the other says reporting complete. Under the reporting complete, if there's an N, chances are you could have some issue with getting a certificate and finishing your reporting because there's missing information. So that's first place I have people look. The second place I have people look is under that PM filter, exemption, or extension, because unless it's a light vehicle, which really weren't supposed to be put in the system, it should not say none. There should not be a none on there. There should be something. If it's a truck that came from the factory with the filtration system, you still have to select PM filter original equipment. And on top of that, you can see that a couple of things in that column actually have years associated with them. The very first one says 2016 NOx exempt area operation. We talked about the NOx area just a few moments ago. If you are using that as a provision to keep your vehicle from having to update to 2010 technology, that's fantastic. But you have to come in and renew it every year. And every year when you renew it, you have to update it to the current year. So it should say 2021 NOx exempt area operation. I've also circled the odometer readings tab. So if you have vehicles that are in the low use option, you really don't have to look at your list so much because all the low use ones are going to be under the odometer readings tab. That is where you would put the information on your what your current reading is for January. Little clues there or something I want to make sure you're aware of related to odometer readings. When you put readings in there, as soon as you hit save, they are recorded and you really can't change them at that point. And it has caused people a lot of difficulty because if they type the wrong number in for the wrong truck or the wrong number by including an extra 0 or 1 or something, it could throw your fleet out of compliance because you put the wrong number in there. Just make sure before you hit save that all the information is correct for each of the vehicles that you have under that tab. When you finished reporting or believe you finished reporting and you go to the compliance status, which is where you can tell what the system has seen, you hopefully will not have it say not eligible for certificate, because what that means is the way you've reported your fleet, you've got something that has your fleet out of compliance. And if you read below where that is, this particular fleet has, let's see, 14 heavy diesel trucks. They've got 15 total reported, which means that there might be a light truck in there. There might be a truck that's a hybrid or something, but they've got 15 trucks total. Only 14 of them are heavy diesel, so only 14 are under the rule. 2 of those vehicles are claiming extension. It says here that all 14 are subject to cleanup at some point, and 6 of them have filtration systems, which when this picture was taken, that was compliance right there. So if all 14 are subject and 2 of them have exemptions, that means in order for this fleet to show as compliant, you would need to have filtered all the rest of the trucks. That would be 12 trucks, and we only have 6 filters. So that's why this is showing not eligible for a certificate. and go back and try and figure out which ones have the issue. So it's another picture of the same thing, except I wanted to show you this click to confirm, because after you finish your reporting and everything is hunky-dory and it's all in compliance and you're all good with everything you put in there, it should say click to confirm. And you're probably thinking, well, I'm all good. Why don't I just get my certificate? Well, unfortunately, this is where the legal system comes back into play, because before we can let you print your certificate, you do have to go through a notification, and you do have to agree that what you've told us is the truth. So you click on that, and it should bring up this. It should say, are you finished reporting? And there is a disclaimer, a confirmation disclaimer, that essentially says, you're telling us the truth. Everything you put in the reporting system is the truth. You click yes on that, it'll tell you to close, that you can close it, and then when you come back to this, it'll allow you to print that certificate. Now, when you click that print certificate button, another window will pop up, and it will be a copy of your certificate, and that should look like this. It'll have your name on it. This was just an example, but it should look like this. While that screen is up, you can print that as many times as you want. Okay? You will not be allowed to save it in any usable form. It is a locked file, and the reason we do that is because early on we had too many people who had full versions of Adobe Acrobat, because it's an Adobe file, where they would modify it, edit it, and hand it to their friends and think that would get them out of, compliance issues. So really early on, I told you that there's a part of this rule that could give you a citation if you did not check to see if a fleet was in compliance or a truck was in compliance before you hired them for your purposes. One of the ways that you can alleviate that responsibility is by asking them for this certificate. This certificate only proves that they've done the reporting and that the reporting system says that what they've done looks compliant. It does not actually check their fleet. It won't check their fleet. But it is, for you, the person asking, it's enough to prove that you did your due diligence and they are, you've checked to see that they're compliant. Our enforcement people will not ask for this certificate, and if you hand them the certificate, they will not use it to determine compliance, because the certificate on its own does not actually determine compliance. We have to actually verify that what the equipment looks like. But that's the certificate. And here's a little bit more information on the actual website for the truck and bus regulation itself. If you clicked on the truck stop to go to the regulatory page, this is where it would take you. You get information about the rule itself, including the regulatory documents, some fact sheets, resources, all kinds of good stuff related to this. And that's truck and bus. So at this point, Katie, you got all the questions handled, right? Do we have any questions that I need to bring up?
No, we're all caught up on the questions so far.
Okay, good deal. Then I'm going to talk about this next level here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Katie. So one of the questions that I get and have gotten for years is, what's next? We passed this truck and bus rule, but that's not the end. What's next? Okay, well, yeah. And a lot of times I said there was nothing next. I didn't know that there was going to be something in addition, or there wasn't anything in place. Well, now I can't say that anymore, because this is what's next. In 2020, 2 regulations were passed, and we're working on the third one listed here. This is the next level of requirement for the trucks that fall under truck and bus. This would be any combustion vehicle over 14,000. Actually, it goes below that, but the first level of requirement is something called ACT, or Advanced Clean Trucks. And it's more of an information gathering requirement. I'll talk about that more in just a minute, but it does also have requirements in there for manufacturers. Again, I'll talk about that in a second. The second level that was adopted was the Low NOx Omnibus, and this was a rule designed to push everything towards electric, but it was a transitional push, because the final regulation is going to be zero emission fleet rules, and that is going to happen between now and 2045 is, I think, the horizon for this to all happen. We're essentially moving the state's heavy duty truck population to zero-emission vehicles. The ACT has two components. The first is a manufacturer's requirement for the sales of zero-emission vehicles, and it's a percentage of their total annual sales. And then the second set is a requirement for reporting for what are called large entities. And I'll talk about both of these. Here is the manufacturer's ZEV sales requirement by year. You can see it starts in 2024, goes all the way to 2035 plus, and it requires the manufacturer to sell the percentages of vehicles you see on that chart as zero emission sales for each of those years. So in 2024, 5% of the Class 2B through Class 3 trucks sold in California have to be zero emission. 9% of the Class 4 through 8 and 5% of the Class 7 through 8. So essentially all the trucks from 6,000 pounds and up. And again, this is the manufacturer's requirement, so it doesn't apply to any of the owners. The owners may fall under this section of it. This is the requirement for reporting. So there's a one-time reporting that happens this year, and right now their timeline is April of this year. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to actually accomplish that, but that's what it is. And it's a requirement for any fleet that has 50 or more trucks, or brokers 50 or more trucks, or any fleet with a greater than $50 million annual revenue. And it covers all government agencies down to the city, county level or local level. If it's a government agency that has these types of vehicles, they're required to do this reporting. We're asking for the information on a one-time basis to create a plan or a path for the zero emission vehicles. We'd like to know how, we need to know how current vehicle technology is used, how many that are out there, so that we can write the zero emission vehicle rules to match what's in existence and make the best path that we possibly can for this to happen. For the future, it's going zero emission. It's already happening in a number of places. I don't know how many of you ever go into any of the ports down in the Southern California area, but the San Pedro ports, the Long Beach ports, they both are already using primarily electric vehicles for in-port activity, and they're slowly working their way to only using electric trucks going in and out of those facilities. It also is going to extend to refuse trucks, buses, utility fleets, and wherever it's fleet feasible for it to happen, these rules are going to push that to happen by 2045. If you have more questions about any of these rules, here's some contact information, web pages, and staff contact for questions related to the ACT, the Zero Emission Fleet Rule, and the NOx Omnibus. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, or she's going to take control, and I'm going to start dealing with the questions.
I was too quick for you that time, Randy. You couldn't even pass it to me.
I know, son of a gun.
All right, so yeah, Randy will take over the question portion, so please feel free to continue using the Q&A box if you guys have questions while I'm talking, but we'll also have a question section at the end. So we do have enforcement teams that operate in California for truck and bus. ARB has two main bases. One is in Southern California and the other one is in Sacramento, but we also have contracts with local air districts to enforce some of the on-road regulations in the San Diego area and also in the Central Valley. If you do see those inspectors or the on-road inspectors in general, they're typically working with CHP officers in the field. There are a few ways that CARB identifies non-compliant fleets. The most common currently is through DMV registration data. So your DMV registration is tied to CARB compliance. And what that means is essentially we can, I think Randy kind of went over this earlier too, but we can see the information in the DMV and pull that and use that to check compliance with truck and bus. So DMV also cross-references with our registration program, and if you're registered in Truck and Bus, they'll make sure that the truck is compliant before providing you with your registration. We also conduct random fleet audits where we verify all the fleet information of a company or an owner and truckers. Like I said, we conduct those field inspections. That can happen at weigh stations. That's the most common. We also check distribution centers, truck stops, basically anywhere that your vehicle comes to a natural stopping point, there's a potential to be inspected. Also, if your fleet's being audited, they may come to your fleet yard just to check that everything is in compliance there, especially if there are flags being thrown up in the audit. And FYI with that I always say, just because I used to be an inspector, is that per the California Health and Safety Code, inspectors have the authority to request to inspect your vehicle. So you do have the option to deny right of entry or right of inspection. But what happens is the inspector is going to issue you a citation for denying entry, and then they're going to most likely obtain a warrant to inspect the vehicle anyway. And because you're kind of trying to stop them from doing that, that's going to get their hairs up, and they're going to think that maybe there's something else going on there. So they're probably going to try to check the entire facility as well. So the moral of that is if you're saying no to avoid a citation, it's not going to get you out of a citation. You'll get a different citation, and it's more than likely not worth your trouble to do that. So just let them get in and out and inspect whatever they're trying to look at and be on your way. The last reason that we typically do inspections is we do take complaints throughout California. Those will be either inspected by the state or by local inspectors. And typically we receive a lot of those regarding either idling or smoking vehicles. For roadside inspections, ARB inspectors are looking for excessive smoke. Like Randy mentioned earlier, they're also looking for the emission control label on the engine. They'll check for any tampering, which includes removing emission control equipment or not properly maintaining it so it's not functioning. They'll also check for illegal use of diesel fuel. So that's like when you're using red dye diesel, which is specifically for off-road or stationary engines. If you use that in an on-road engine, it's subject to less taxes, so that's an issue, and it also can cause you to be referred to the IRS because it's a form of tax evasion. So do not use the red dye diesel in your on-road vehicles. Again, that's strictly for off-road and stationary vehicles. And you won't be able to get that at a gas station a lot of the time anyway, so shouldn't have that happen on accident. For our current on-road programs, there are two things typically that drive the inspections in the field. One is if the inspectors are set up doing inspections and they see an old vehicle, a lot of times they'll pull that over just to make sure that it's, filtered and the engine is compliant. And the other reason is if they see a smoking vehicle of any age. So even if it's a brand new vehicle, if it's smoking, that's going to indicate that there's something wrong with the DPF. If a truck has a filter, it shouldn't be smoking pretty much at all. A lot of times the smoke coming from the exhaust of an engine isn't even visible until about 2% opacity. So if inspectors see anywhere above 2% out of a new vehicle, that's going to indicate there's an issue going on there. In addition to the truck and bus regulation, we do have another regulation to minimize smoking vehicles, which is the periodic smoke inspection program. That regulation was put into place in 1998, and inspectors are certified to do visible emissions evaluation just using their eyes, but also we have equipment to do that in the field. But generally what that means is even before you pull over the truck, they have a pretty good idea of what opacity the smoke coming out of the exhaust is. Opacity just refers to the thickness of the smoke coming out of the exhaust. So the higher the opacity, the thicker the smoke. Once an inspector sees a truck that's smoking above a certain opacity, they're going to have the CHP pull that truck over to do a heavy-duty vehicle inspection for the HD VIP program. They will use a meter that's held to the smokestack, and that tests the opacity of the smoke. That's typically referred to as a snap test. So if they're asking you to rev your engine, normally they'll do it 3 times and check the opacity. Another program that's different from the HD VIP program that you're responsible for is the periodic smoke inspection program. PSIP has the same opacity requirements as a field test or a snap test that's conducted by ARB staff, but it's annually required, and it's required to be conducted by the owner or a contractor that the owner hires, if the owner meets the applicability. The old opacity requirements are shown at the bottom of this slide. So you can see it used to be 40% and 55%, but they've lowered considerably with the technology of the new trucks. If you had a filter truck and it was putting out 40% opacity, that would be a crazy amount for a filter to put out. There'd be something hugely wrong with that. So we went ahead and lowered those opacity limits. In order to be subject to PSIP, the fleet needs to be California-based and consisting of 2 or more vehicles with a gross vehicle weight rating of greater than 6,000 pounds. So if you own 2 or more vehicles, as I just described, you are subject to this regulation. If you only have 1 vehicle, you do not meet the requirements. The test is required to be conducted on any vehicle that has an engine model year older than 4 years. So if you have 2 trucks, one is 5 years old and the other is 2 years old, you are subject to the regulation, but you're only required to perform the test on the older vehicle. You don't have to test the new one until it's 4 years old. So if you have a vehicle with a 2019 engine, for example, you need to start testing once it reaches 4 years old in 2022. When I conduct the PSIP test on the vehicles, they do have to meet the updated opacity requirements. Here's some recent amendments to the on-road regulations. Again, we lowered the opacity limits for heavy-duty inspection program that's enforced by ARB and district staff, and also the same opacity limits for the periodic smoke inspection conducted by fleets. We began requiring some training to conduct PSIP testing, and we also opened up a reporting system to allow the submittal of onboard diagnostics instead of conducting the PSIP. So this is what the new opacity limits have been lowered to. As you can see, most of the engines that are equipped with the diesel particulate system will now have to meet an opacity limit of 5%. Again, this is because if your DPF is functioning correctly, it should ideally be emitting less than 1%. A DPF that's operating correctly is certified to remove 99.9% of particulate. So if it's emitting more than 2% or so, there's probably an issue like a crack in the ceramic or something along those lines, or it could just be needing a full regeneration. It could possibly have not been regenerating properly. Be aware that for a lot of the opacity meters, they can read the smoke at these lower levels and give you an accurate number, but unless the software has been updated, the pass-fail readout may be incorrect. So because the opacity limits were lower, if the software is out of date, let's say you get a 6.5% opacity reading, it could say pass on the meter, even though that's a failing result just because the software is out of date. So just double check with your meter manufacturer, make sure your software is up to date. And for equipment that's not filtered, such as some light duty vehicles or heavy duty vehicles that are using flexibility options, the opacity limit for those are based on their engine year, and they range from 20 to 40%. There are a couple ways that you can conduct a PSIP test in compliance with the requirements. If you contract someone to do the testing for you, typically that's going to run somewhere in the $50 to $150 range per vehicle that's tested. In order for someone to provide PSIP tests as a contracted service, they have to have undergone the HDVIP PSIP training course at the California Council on Diesel Education and Technology. That certification is a one-day training course, and it needs to be renewed every 4 years. So if somebody you contract is doing this test for you, make sure that their certification is valid. They need to enter their certification number into the opacity meter in order for it to be a valid test. We've also been getting a lot of questions recently from attendees on whether these courses are still being offered with the current COVID situation. The answer is yes. They're online courses and they're being offered for the CCDAT certification. So if you go to the CCDET site, you can find the specifics on their class schedule page. We do have the link up here on this slide. A second option is for someone inside your company to conduct the test. So this is the direct fleet employed option. In that scenario, you or your employee does not need to attend the CCDET course. The only training that's required is the CARB training course, which is MS 529. MS 529 is a free course. The trainee needs to complete any option available to contracted smoke testers in that training. After the completion of the course, you will be emailed a certificate and a tester number. So again, you have to enter your tester number into the opacity meter when you conduct a test in order for it to be a legal test. This regulation is being enforced at the state and local level. As with any rule, the reason we enforce it is to create a level playing field among fleet owners. If we have a rule that's not enforced, then the people who are complying of their own choice are going to be at a disadvantage for investing in cleaning up their fleets. Currently, the big focus for enforcement is Senate Bill 1, which started in 2017. That's the legislation that tied vehicle registration to compliance with the truck and bus regulation. We've had the authority to hold registrations for years, but this is the first implementation of actually doing so. So now we'll get into more detail on SB 1. So this was more well known as the gas tax. I know a lot of times when I'm driving down the road, you'll see the road repair signs that say your SB1 dollars at work. The long name for this bill was the Road Repair and Accountability Act. So the road repair part is what you're seeing on the highway, the upgrades to the highways. But the accountability side of this regulation is what affects the owner-operators that fall under the scope of the truck and bus regulation. So vehicles now need to be in compliance with the truck and bus regulation in order to register that vehicle with DMV. If you have an engine model year that needs to be reported in our system, if it's not reported and using a compliance option, or reported to have a filter, or reported to have upgraded the engine, any of those options you're allowed to use, then your registration will be held by the DMV and you will be unable to register your vehicle until you rectify the compliance issues in truckers. Now, our regulation is based on engine model year, but because DMV does not have access to engine model years, their registration holds are going to be based on your chassis model year. So most of the time, your engine model year is 1 year older than the chassis model year that's reported in the vehicle. So if you do happen to have an engine model year that's the same as your chassis model year, you can report that into the EDVR site that Randy went over earlier. By 2023, the only way to register your vehicle will be if it has a 2010 engine or if it's reported as a low-use vehicle or a NOx exempt vehicle. So what if you don't have a 2011 or newer vehicle? Now remember, I'm saying 2011 vehicle because the engine model year is typically 1 year older. So essentially, what if I don't have a 2010 or newer engine? If you have a 22 or newer engine, you won't see any of this happening. If you don't, you need to either access the reporting system or repower the vehicle. So remember, DMV has access to truckers if your engine is beyond the model year schedule and you haven't reported using a flexibility option, they will hold your registration. If you're reported correctly, there should be no issue with a registration hold. I know we do occasionally get people that are having issues with registration holds even though they're reported properly or their truck is compliant. Sometimes that's just an issue with the VIN or things like that. You can always get in contact with us and we'd be happy to facilitate working with DMV for you. Here's some contact information if you have questions. The 866 diesel line is staffed 5 days a week, and we also have the email that goes to the staff if you're reporting and have compliance questions. So now we'll talk about the tractor trailer greenhouse gas or GHG regulation. This regulation was passed in 2008 and implemented in 2010, so we're now over a decade into this regulation. It is a bit unique in that it doesn't have anything directly to do with the emission source or the engine of the vehicle. It requires owners and operators of specific types of vehicles to reduce fuel consumption by making the vehicles more aerodynamic. This program is based on a federal program that's called SmartWay. SmartWay is a program that certifies certain equipment by manufacturers that makes vehicles more aerodynamic and fuel efficient and therefore use less fuel. So if you see trucks on the highway and they have the flaps below the trailer, you're seeing trucks using this SmartWay program. So who must comply? Anyone with a 53-foot or longer box type trailer operating in California. This is anyone that owns, drives, leases, rents, sells, or even is a broker dispatcher for this type of vehicle. You're required to comply with the GHG regulation. It applies to the trailer and the tractor that pulls them. These vehicles are required to use SmartWay verified technology and the installation of low rolling resistance or LRR tires. Those are tires that meet aerodynamic guidelines to provide less resistance with the road and therefore increase fuel efficiency. The general regulation phase-in schedule deadlines have already passed, so we're basically looking at a history of when these requirements were completed. It was phased in by model year, but again, you have to add various technologies in order to get their fuel efficiency to increase by a minimum of 5% and institute the use of low rolling resistance tires. If you have a refrigerated dry van, you only had to go to 4% fuel savings and LRR tires. You may or may not have seen a lot of enforcement with specific regard to this regulation because this rule almost doesn't need enforcing. And the reason for that is that typically the fuel cost savings outweigh the initial upfront costs of installing this equipment. So because people are using these technologies and saving money, it's not actually very hard for us to get compliance. When you're driving on the highway, almost every truck you see has at least one of these technologies installed. So we see the wings that were at the beginning of this presentation. Those provide a 5% improvement on a non-refrigerated trailer. You see that on most trucks these days. You can also see the box flaps that are at the back of the trailer, and those provide a 2 to 3% increase in fuel efficiency. There are a couple ways that you can get out of these requirements. They're called the local haul and short haul tractors. Local haul only travel within a 100-mile radius of their home base, and a short haul tractor is any tractor that drives less than 50,000 miles per year. If you are a local haul tractor, then you have no requirements under this regulation. If you're a short haul tractor, then you only have the requirement of installing the low rolling resistance tires. If you want to use either of these options, you do have to report. So there is a reporting system for this regulation. Now we'll get into some of the clean transportation and energy saving projects. This is basically our incentive programs we have available. The first thing I always say with this section is a disclaimer. So I'm going to briefly touch on what these programs entail, but because funding information is constantly changing, I'm not going to go into too much detail, and I don't necessarily know what's currently available. A lot of the funding opportunities are through your local air district, so if you are interested, they're most likely going to have your most up-to-date information on what's currently available. There are 35 local air districts, and they have the authority to enforce and implement their own air regulations. So just double check with them to see if they have any programs available for you. So our first program we'll get into is the Hybrid and Zero Emission Voucher Incentive Program. This program's funding is determined by the legislature, so it changes every year. A lot of these programs I'm going to go over also received less funding this year due to the budget situation for the state that was caused by COVID. HVIP is designed to try to get alternate technologies, so non-combustion type vehicles, into your fleets and into the markets. There are thousands of new alternative fuel technology vehicles coming out and thousands of projects that are being worked on right now. So there's a lot of money being invested into those type of technologies, both by businesses and funding programs. In this program, a voucher is provided to cover part of the vehicle purchase for those type of vehicles. This program is run through your local air district. The Truck Loan Assistance Program is not a local air district program. It is run through the Air Resources Board. The main difference between this and the other funding programs is that the money available for fleets can be for fleets that are not currently in compliance. So typically with funding opportunities, your fleet needs to be in compliance in order to be eligible. If your fleet is not in compliance or if you have any open violations, even if you're going to be out of compliance very soon, a lot of times you're not eligible for funding, for public funding. And the reason for that is public funds are not available to pay for compliance. So the goal of these programs is specifically to make improvements to the air quality that would not have been made otherwise. In the situation where you're out of compliance or you're going out of compliance, that's an upgrade that is going to have to be made anyway, or that truck is going to be retired anyway. So there's a low cost benefit for us if we provide funding to those programs. The shortest amount of time I've seen for a fleet to be eligible for public funds before a compliance deadline was 1 year. So just try to keep that in mind. If you're planning on applying for public funds, it needs to be beyond that deadline. So you want it at least a year out, probably even more. The earlier, the better. For the Truck Loan Assistance Program, again, this is one of, I think actually maybe our only program that does not require you to be in compliance in order to receive funds. That being said, this one is also a difference in that it's a loan and not a grant. So this program was built to provide funding to business owners that may not have been able to get a loan otherwise. Essentially, the state of California is co-signing your loan. If you need loan assistance to get into a newer vehicle, this is a very helpful avenue for a lot of people. The Voucher Incentive Program, this is another one where your fleet does need to be compliant to be eligible. It's allocated to smaller fleets, so those with 10 or fewer vehicles, and the vehicles must be operated mainly in California over the last 2 years. Typically, no more than 50 to 60% of the cost of the new truck is going to be covered. For this one, you can contact your local dealer or your local air district to see if you're eligible for these funds and if they have funds currently available. If you need more information or incentive and loans, we do have some websites here. You can also join our listserv, and that sends out automatic updates for public workshops. It lets you know about upcoming regulations, upcoming funds, and upcoming trainings. It's a great way to stay in the loop. And additionally, we've added a couple of contacts on here for you to find out about other programs. Randy and I just found out today that Ambreen is going to be out for the next 2 months. So if you do want to contact ARB, go ahead and contact Violet. I know she's still working. So we also have some additional resources for you. So if you have any questions about the truck and bus regulation, the diesel hotline is available to you. They can walk you through your fleet, your compliance if you're having any issues. If you do have a complex question about your fleet, like say you're in reporting season right now and you go and you're trying to report and your fleet's been flagged or locked, you're going to have to email Truckers, which is that email that you see on screen. We also have the Truck Stop website, which Randy mentioned earlier, that shows our upcoming trainings and has fact sheets and other resources for you. But other than that, this is our last slide for today. So I just want to thank everyone for attending, and I'll go ahead and open it up for questions and pass it back to Randy to put up a timer so you guys know how much time you have left.
Okay, I'll put the timer on. Katie, there, I was in the middle of answering a question. If you want to finish that one up, that would be fantastic. So
yeah, we can just verbally address them too.
Okay, let me get in here. Did you already give me the
I didn't pass it back. I'll get that.
All right. Show my screen. Gosh dang it. There we go. All right. So I was trying to answer a question, looks like, without pulling this out. Let's see here. Under the new electric program, what does it mean in 2045 when it states that all other vehicles were feasible? My response going through was the information we're going to be collecting in the 2021 reporting is going to make it clear what we can and can't actually require to be zero emission. But if the technology doesn't work for certain type of operations, we can't require it in those type of operations. So if we don't have, I mean, things like battery life, for example, if you've got long haul tractor trailers that need to go 500, 600, 800 miles in a day, and the batteries that are built for those don't allow you to do that, then it's not really feasible to require that kind of thing. That's just an example. I can't tell you exactly what is going to be the feasible and non-feasible part, but again, the reporting for next year, or this year, sorry, is one of the things that we're going to be using to try and make the determination as to what's feasible and what's not. At this point, we just put what's feasible as a disclaimer because we know it's zero emission vehicles for heavy vehicles, heavy duty diesel vehicles. It's not going to work everywhere, and it's not going to work for every situation. So that's the answer that I was trying to get across, and I think that was all right. So, all right, that was for Carson? No,
Troy.
Troy. Who's next on there? Are you answering any of these other ones?
I am looking at one. It looks like you were having a conversation and they updated. So they said their fleet is compliant. I was trying to figure out what that's in reference to still.
Yeah, they were asking about the requirement for 2010, well, for their vehicles under the GHG only needing the low rolling resistance tires. They're more than 53 foot or longer. They are, I was asking them what model year the chassis and the trailer were, because if it's 2010 or older, then the low rolling resistance tire is what's required for that kind of vehicle. If it's 2011 to 14, then you're required to have the low rolling resistance tires and the retrofits for aerodynamics. And then the newer ones are already built with it. So anything newer than 2014 is already built phase 1 GHG compliant. So it should be fine.
Okay, and then the next question, we have somebody that went to register a truck as low use and enter the odometer readings, and they can't enter the info. So they're wondering if they missed a step. So if you're, go ahead, Randy.
I was going to say, you're probably not missing a step. What happens, you don't see it because a message should be coming up. At least this is my opinion. There might be a lock on your account for some reason, and you have to work with the trucker staff to get that in there. It could be the first time you're putting this in. It could be that you need to supply some other additional information, but they won't allow you to save it. If they don't allow you to save it, if the trucker's reporting system doesn't allow you to save it, you need to contact truckers at arb.ca.gov, and the staff there will work through what the issue is. What were you going to say, Katie?
I was going to recommend calling the diesel hotline first, just because they can see the back end of your account too. So when you're doing your reporting, they can go into your fleet and see if there's a flag or something like that. So I think, we don't have the slide up anymore. If you downloaded the handout, it's like I said, that last resources page has all their contact info on it. But if you call them, they can walk you through the reporting, no problem. So they should either be able to tell you what button you're supposed to be clicking, or if there is a flag, they can walk you or refer you to truckers. Okay, and then the next question. So this company uses Root Vac trucks for septic type service. How would they go about working to find out if that's going to be feasible?
I don't really have an answer for that. Because
is this referring to the electrification still?
Yeah, I don't know that type of use. I don't know if there's a truck being built or even in concept right now for that type of use that functions strictly electric. Mm-hmm. And if there isn't, then it's not feasible. But trying to find that out is going to be based on determining whether or not there's something built that can do that. And I don't think there is right now, but that's the process we're talking about, is getting to the point where If something's built and it's reasonable, it's reasonably available, then yeah, it's probably going to be part of the requirement.
Okay, and this is a good question. So this person works as a registration service, and they're asking if they can use the same email for different customers. Randy, I don't know if you've heard anything about this lately, but the last I heard, both truckers and doors were trying to discourage consultants from putting their own emails in as the responsible party.
Mm-hmm.
So you can actually get their account flagged if that happens. So I would say put in the owner's information, and then if they get that just makes sure that they're getting all of our important documentation we send to them, and then it doesn't all go to you. And then it also kind of streamlines it for like them getting the information and being able to access their account. So if they called in and it was your information, they would not necessarily be able to access their own account.
Yeah, so I didn't know that latest thing about the accounts being flagged, but I know that we have always said, and I've always said that the owner of the account should have their email in there. We've had too many times where your service is no longer being used by that company, and that company can't get into their account because their email is not part of it. They're not getting notified. So we would prefer that it was their email.
All right, Randy, we have another question. If it's farm equipment and it has SE plates, do they still have to report?
Farm equipment with SE plates is not necessarily exempt from the regulation. You have to actually be registered as a specialty vehicle under the ag provision to get any kind of exemption. And if that's not already done that way, then it's not going to happen. It's way past the time frame for that. So you are opening yourself up to some issues if that's you. Now, I don't know all the rules with DMV and SE plates, whether or not they have to go through the same registration, that any other truck does. So you may not run into the DMV issues that we were talking about, but just because it has SE plates does not exempt it.
Okay, and then we have another question. They have a 2008 truck. What should they do now to make sure that it can be marked as low use in 2023?
You don't need to do anything now. In January of 2023, you would, if you're not already in the reporting system, you would enter your fleet information and the truck information and then opt it into the low use exemption at that time. At this point, that truck is fully compliant until January 1st of 2023.
And then just make sure it has a functioning odometer at that time.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Or a hub meter.
Yeah. Okay, if they're currently using an ag exemption, could we switch to NOx before 2023?
I believe that's possible. You'd have to install a filter on it, and you have an ag slot. So there's lots of different things that can happen there. I mean, you could slide a different vehicle into that slot as long as it was one model year engine newer, and take the vehicle in there out, make sure it's filtered and drop it into low NOx. But that's those machinations are something that the trucker staff would be able to handle, and they may have additional requirements on getting you there. We still got questions coming in, Katie?
They're kind of coming in waves right now, so we're caught up currently, but I was thinking about giving it one more minute unless you're
No,
ready
that's
to
fine.
call it.
I'll wait. It's 2:37 right now. Why don't I just call it at 2:40?
Okay, sounds good.
All right, I've got 2:40 on my clock. Katie, there were no other questions that came in?
Nope, we're all caught up.
All right, everybody, I appreciate your time. Those of you that are still here, we will catch up with you next time around, but thanks for your time and good afternoon.